encourage your soul, enlighten your mind, and empower your faith. This is the Light Network. We're inviting the heart of Jesus into our lives and ways. Welcome to Today with Jesus. I'm Robert Hatfield.
And I'm Dan Winkler. How you doing today, Robert?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm doing super, but my feelings are hurt.
Why?
Well, I was looking at the screen a minute ago.
Yeah.
And hang on, my screen just went down on me.
Should our listeners know that you're running a computer that's a decade old and that it's finally giving up the ghost?
It is doing that for sure.
All right.
So my feelings are hurt. I'm looking at my screen and automatically it says you have been muted when you started the music.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Did you not want to hear me hum along with that music?
It's an automatic feature. I didn't have anything to do with that. I apologize.
And then it comes back on when we're ready to talk.
Yeah.
You just didn't want to hear me sing. That's why my feelings are hurt.
Yeah, people don't know that the Today with Jesus song actually has words, and you sing them every time. But I mute it, so we'll never know what the lyrics are.
Oh, that's probably a good thing. We are in season 8. That's hard for me to fathom. Mm-hmm. But in season 8, we are focusing on what Jesus meant by the title disciple. Mm-hmm. And that because, Matthew 28, verse 19, he gives us the commission, go make disciples of all the nations. And so we have the challenge and the joy of involving ourselves in the lives of people and helping them become what Jesus would have them and would have all of us to be. Mm-hmm. But when we see this passage, we have that one imperative or command, make disciples. And there are 3 things involved in making a disciple for Jesus. First, there's go. Well, we have to, of course, involve ourselves in the lives of others, invest in friendships and relationships. Next, we are to go, make disciples of all nations, baptizing. Those with whom we invest ourselves or in whom we invest ourselves, we are to encourage them to do what Jesus says to do to be forgiven of our past, and that is to be immersed, thus contacting his cleansing blood. And then we are to go baptizing, and then it says teaching them to observe all things that I have, past tense, commanded you. So we think about this. Well, what had Jesus already commanded relative to being a disciple? How do you make a disciple of somebody? You focus on what Jesus said about discipleship or being a disciple. And that's where we are in this season as we now focus on Matthew chapter 10, verse 25. There are 9 key passages and some parallels as well, but 9 key passages where Jesus employed the word disciple. For several weeks, we looked at Matthew 10, verse 24. It says, a disciple is not above his teacher, nor a servant above his master. And from that, you'll remember, following along in our podcast, we saw from that passage, to Jesus, a disciple is someone who listens to Jesus. A disciple is not above his teacher. The disciple doesn't tell Jesus how the disciple is going to live. The disciple listens to Jesus in his teachings through the Gospels, and then in his teachings via his apostles and inspired spokesman through the rest of the New Testament. A disciple listens to Jesus and lets Jesus dictate through the New Testament belief system and behavior. But now we have verse 25. Robert, if you'd read verse 25 for us, I'd like to focus primarily on just 3 words of the verse.
All right. It is enough for the disciple to be like his teacher and the servant like his master. If they've called the master of the house Beelzebul, how much more will they malign those of his household?
The 3 words that I would like for us to think about are the first 3 words of the verse. It is enough. It is enough for the disciple to do this. To do what? It is enough for the disciple to be like his teacher. Of course, for those of us who are Christians, our teacher is Jesus Christ. And so when we take that thought back to verse 25 of Matthew 10, it's enough for the disciple, for me, for you, for those of us who strive to be what Jesus wants to be us to be as disciples. It is enough for us to just be like Jesus. Robert, think about that. That's a phenomenal statement. You know, it doesn't make any difference what my bank account looks like, how much I have or little. It's enough for me to just be like Jesus. It doesn't matter what kind of car I drive, what kind of clothing that I wear, how expensive or not it is. It doesn't matter where I am as people climb the social ladder. It doesn't matter where I am when it comes to my vocation, whether I'm at the head of the stream calling the shots or in positions of servitude. It just doesn't matter. All that matters to me, it's enough for me to just be like Jesus. And so what I have in my bank account and how I use my car and the way that I dress and the way that I function at work, all of this is governed by my just wanting to be like Jesus. So in Matthew 10:24, as far as Jesus is concerned, a disciple is someone who listens to him. And then in Matthew 10, verse 25, according to Jesus' use of the word disciple, a disciple is someone who tries to look like him. A disciple listens to Jesus, and a disciple tries to look like Jesus in all of the affairs of life. I'd like for us to think about that and throw it in your direction for a while, Robert, and talk to me about, well, okay, what did Jesus look like? I know Isaiah 53 tells us, as far as his physical features were concerned, he had no form or comeliness, and there was no beauty that we should desire him, meaning he wasn't tall, dark, and handsome. So it wasn't his physical features that drew people to him. What was it that drew people to Jesus? What did he look like by the way he functioned?
Yeah. It's amazing to think about, to go through and look and see how often it is emphasized that we are supposed to look like Jesus. And I wonder if we just begin with this verse where we are, it is enough. You ought to find contentment in looking like your teacher.
I love that. Find contentment in.
Yeah, so I have to ask and answer for myself, am I content in, or maybe better stated, is it my goal to look like Jesus? And I was just impressed as I reminded myself in preparation for this how often the scriptures emphasize that Jesus is our goal. We're supposed to look like him. Let's start in Romans 8, verse 29. For those whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, in order that he might be the firstborn among many brothers. All right, the goal is that I, as a Christian, will be conformed to the image of Jesus. Add to that Philippians 3:21. He will transform our lowly body to be like his glorious body by the power that enables him even to subject all things to himself. All right, one day we're going to be transformed to be like him, that is, Jesus. Add to that 1 Corinthians 15, verse 49. Just as we have borne the image of the man of dust, Paul says in the resurrection chapter, we shall also bear the image of the man of heaven. The man of dust, a reference to the first man, Adam. The man of heaven, a reference to the second Adam, so to speak, that is to say, Jesus himself.
Beautiful.
Colossians 3, verse 10, we've put on the new self, which is being renewed in knowledge after the image of its creator. That is the creator of the one who's made us new, our new self. That's Jesus. So the goal is that we're going to look like him. So that's why John says in 1 John 3, 1 and 2, look at what kind of love the Father's given to us, that we should be called children of God, and so we are. The reason why the world doesn't know us is that it didn't know him. Beloved, we are God's children now, and what we will be has not yet appeared, but we know this, that when he appears, we shall be like him, because we'll see him as he is. I'm confident this isn't an exhaustive list from the scriptures, but the emphasis is definitely there, that the goal for a Christian is to be like Jesus. So the question is, am I content with being like Jesus, or am I trying to pursue something else?
So let me see if I've got these. I was having to rummage around here to get a pencil to write
I wondered
these
what
down.
you were doing over there.
I know. I had to take my headphones off and reach around and get my pen.
Okay.
I couldn't reach it. So I have Romans 8:29.
Yeah.
And then I have 1 Corinthians 15:49. Did I miss one between those?
Philippians 3:21 was in the middle there.
Philippians 3:21. So let me see if I got them all.
Yeah.
Romans 8:29,
Uh-huh.
Philippians 3:21,
Yeah.
1 Corinthians 15:49,
Yeah.
Colossians 3:10, 1 John 3:1 and 2.
That's it. Yeah.
All emphasize the fact that we should strive to look like Jesus. That's beautiful.
So the question becomes, how does Jesus look?
There you go.
And let's spend just a minute or two, maybe a little longer than that, but I'm trying to leave you some time at the end of the episode, thinking about how Jesus looks. And let's overlay that against the analogy of his physical appearance. We don't know a whole lot about Jesus's physical appearance. We know this: he has no, I learned it in the King James, he has no form nor comeliness that we should desire him. Isaiah prophesied in Isaiah 53. So Jesus's draw wasn't his physical attraction. It wasn't that he was maybe physically attractive like a celebrity might be that draws a lot of attention to him.
Right.
But boy, look at how attractive Jesus is when we consider his features and how Scripture describes them. For example, think about Jesus's eyes. What must it have been like to look into the eyes of Jesus? Matthew chapter 9 says that Jesus, when he looked at the crowds, he saw them and he had compassion on them. I suggest that Jesus' eyes were filled with compassion. He saw the crowds, he had compassion. By the way, this is emphasized in Matthew 9:36, Matthew 14:14, Matthew 15:32, Luke 7:13, over and over again, and I didn't give the parallels, but over and over again, Jesus emphasizes Jesus' eyesight is coupled with compassion. So much so that when Jesus tells the story of the Samaritan whom we call good, he commends the Samaritan by saying that when the Samaritan came to where the man was who had been beaten and robbed and left for dead, when he saw him, he had compassion. But look at Luke 10:37. You go and do likewise. Jesus' eyes saw others with mercy and compassion, and my eyes are to adopt that same outlook. I'm to look at others with mercy and compassion. Consider next Jesus' lips. I imagine that Jesus must have had an inviting smile on his face. You know, sometimes you can look at somebody and based on the way that they carry their lips, you can sort of tell the demeanor of that person. Sometimes they'll have a frown. And you couple that with eyebrows and a few other nonverbal communications, and you pretty much have the personality of that person summed up. I think Jesus must have had a very welcoming demeanor, and in addition to his compassionate eyes, his lips, his mouth must have communicated a welcoming presence as he dispenses words that are life-giving. Man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God, Jesus said in Matthew 4, verse 4. And Paul says over in 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 1, that Jesus was one who was meek and who was gentle. I got the wrong verse on the screen. Let's try again. I, Paul, myself entreat you by the meekness and gentleness of Christ, he says. I who am humble when face to face, but bold toward you when I'm away. But here's a styling of Jesus that I suppose we would have picked up on just by what Jesus did and the way he interacted with others. But Paul actually comes out and says that Jesus was meek, Jesus was gentle. And we see that gentleness of Jesus even in the events surrounding the cross. Isaiah 53 tells us in verse 7 that just like a sheep, as it's led to the slaughter, does not open its mouth, so Jesus did the same. When Philip interacts with the Ethiopian eunuch in Acts 8:35, that is one of the passages that this eunuch is reading as he's traveling down the road from Jerusalem. Peter tells us in 1 Peter 2:22 and 23 that when he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten. So Jesus used his mouth to communicate the truth of God, and in so doing that, by the way, in a gentle and meek way, and yet boldly, no doubt, but his mouth, his lips must have been a welcoming presence. Jesus reminds us in Matthew chapter 15, verse 8, of people who would honor him with their lips, but their hearts are far from him. And then if I go down to verse 18, he says, what comes out of the mouth proceeds from the heart, and this defiles a person. So the things that are coming out of my mouth, well, they're supposed to flow from the characteristics of Jesus. Of course, there are other passages. James gives us basically a whole chapter on the way we use our tongues. Let's move down and think about Jesus' hands for a minute. Jesus was busy blessing others as he went about his Father's business. Some of the earliest recorded words of Jesus during his time on earth come from Luke 2:49 when Jesus is just 12 years old. Did you not know that I would be about my Father's business? And Jesus instilled that same sort of work ethic. We think about the hands, we think about the way that we work. Jesus instilled that work ethic in his disciples. John 9, verse 4, we must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. And then when I think about Jesus' hands, boy, I can't help but think about the hands that Thomas saw after Jesus' resurrection in John 20. Put your finger here, he said to Thomas, and see my hands. Put out your hand and place it in my side. Do not disbelieve, but believe. And Thomas answered, my Lord and my God. But you think about those hands that bore the marks of not only Jesus being willing to submit to the plan of God, but as Paul will say in Philippians 2, even death on a cross. And those nail prints, that mark in his side, are all marks of service, yes, to God, but also in many ways, in many senses, to us. So I think about what Jesus said. Jesus was a person who was busy putting his hands to the work, and he said in Matthew 9:37 and 38, pray earnestly to the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest. He wants you and me to be busy as well. And finally, let's consider Jesus' feet. His feet walked about sharing good news. part of what it means that Jesus was the Christ. When I think about Acts chapter 10, verse 38, he went about doing good. He went about doing good. And in that sense, we could think about how Paul says in Romans chapter 10, for example, verse 15, how beautiful are the feet of those who preach the good news, quoting from Isaiah. So Jesus wants our feet to carry us, and in a sense, we sometimes say we are to be the hands and the feet of Jesus even today. So consider, it is enough, Jesus says, that we are like our teacher, that we are like him. And all of our goal as a Christian is culminated in this idea of being like Jesus, Romans 8:29, Philippians 3:21, and others. So what does that mean? Jesus' eyes looked with compassion. Mine should too. Jesus' mouth spoke God's words, and he used his words to build up and encourage others in the faith. Mine should too. Jesus' hands were busy about his Father's business, and mine ought to be too. Jesus' feet went about doing good, and mine ought to as well. I think that this analogy, at least, is helpful to me. I just love thinking about what must Jesus have looked like, and I'm looking forward to seeing him as he is. But the text also says I'm going to be like him, and so I'm working today by his grace to be recreated into the image of him who made me new. And in so doing, I will adopt these, overlaying with these physical analogies, features and characteristics of who Jesus is. That's got to be what it means to be his disciple, right?
To look like him.
To look like him.
His eyes, his lips were smile, his hands, his feet. What about his heart? Let's think about his heart for a little bit. And I'm going to ask us all to go to Philippians chapter 2 for that. In Philippians chapter 2, verse 5, the Apostle Paul, I love the way the American Standard Version uses this passage. Have this mind in you, which was also in Christ Jesus. And the word for mind there carries the idea of thinking the way Jesus thought, feeling the way Jesus felt. And so actually we're being challenged to, as you said just a minute ago, Robert, to recreate ourselves into being like Jesus. We're to think as he thought, feel as he felt, so that when others see us, we can parrot the words of Paul. It is no longer I that live, but Christ who lives in me. Or again, for me to live is Christ and to die is gain. So we're to be people that show Jesus to others by the way we interact with others, by the way we act before others, always showing people Jesus. But again, what do they see in us when they see Jesus? They will see eyes of compassion, and they will hear lips that speak the blessed gospel that relates to Jesus. And they will see hands that help others as his hands went about doing good, helping others. And they'll see feet that carry the gospel of Jesus next door and abroad. But look inside of Jesus. And what do you see? The Bible tells us that out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks, Matthew 10. But if we were to go back to the Old Testament, it says, keep your heart with all diligence, for out of it are the issues of life, paraphrased. What you are on the inside is what others are going to see on the outside. So as a man thinks in his heart, so is he. Both of those latter passages, of course, coming from Proverbs 4 and Proverbs 27. So what do you see inside of Jesus? Look at his heart And then think of the heart that we are to be showing others by the way we speak and the way we make decisions and the way we live before others. In Philippians 2, it says, okay, think the way Jesus thought, feel the way Jesus felt. But if we keep reading in Philippians 2 from verses 5 and following, we find several different lessons to learn from the heart of Jesus. Reading from the English Standard Version, have this mind among yourselves or in you, which is yours in Christ, who, now it's going to be telling us about Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped or miserly held on to. Let's pause there for just a moment. Think of how selfless Jesus was. He was equal with God, but did not think of that essence as something to be held on to. You remember the first words of John chapter 1, Robert? In the beginning was the Word, and how does that go?
The Word was with God. The Word was God.
He was with God and he was God. He bore the very essence of God. And of course, verse 14 of John 1 tells us the Word became flesh. We beheld his glory, glory as the only begotten of the Father. That's Jesus. So here was Jesus before he was Jesus, given that name. Here was Jesus before his becoming flesh. He was known as the rhyme and reason of everything to the mind of a Jew. He was known as the Logos, the Word, and he was with God, and he bore the very essence of deity. He was God. And so Hebrews chapter 1 tells us he has the very character of God. He is divine. So here was one who was equal to God, with God, but he didn't miserly hold on to that. I'll go all the way back to Genesis chapter 3 and the temptation of Eve. And she invited all of the misery into this world by inviting sin into this world because she wanted to be like God. That's what the devil said to her. You take of this and you can be like God. And that's why God doesn't want you to have it. And so she invited sin into the world because she wanted to be like God. Jesus was like God, but he wouldn't hold on to that. See how selfless he was? But I keep reading in Philippians 2, and verse 7 goes on. He emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, born in the likeness of men or man. He emptied himself. Look at the sacrificial heart of Jesus. He was selfless in that he didn't hold on to his equality with God. And then he emptied himself, taking the form of man. He was sacrificial. And then look at the serving mindset of Jesus. He emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, not the form of royalty, but the form of literally a slave. And so he would say, the Son of Man came not to be ministered to, but to minister and to give his life a ransom for many. And so the heart of Jesus was the heart of a servant who helped others. And then I keep reading, and it says, he was born in the likeness of men, and being found in human form, he humbled himself, becoming obedient to the point of death. And so this serving heart was willing to be submissive to God, even to the point of dying for mankind in keeping with the plan of God. Let me ask you a deep question, Robert. Are you ready?
I don't know.
Did Jesus want to die? That's pretty deep.
That is deep.
So what would you say?
Uh, yes and no.
Okay. So explain your answer. That would be my answer too, but
Yeah.
explain why you say that.
Well, he emphasized over and over that he was going to do the will of his Father, and that he delighted to do the will of his Father. And so did he want to die? Well, yes, because that was the will of the Father.
There you go.
And by the way, he was in unison, I think, as all the members of the Godhead were and are, for the plan of salvation, which necessitated his blood being shed.
Mm-hmm.
But on the other hand, the what trips you up is in the garden the night before he dies, he's praying, if there's any other way, let this cup pass. And I can only imagine, but what the physical pain, but also the spiritual separation from.
Oh, yes.
Why have you forsaken me?
Right.
Would be something that, whatever I say here is going to come up short, but that he would dread. I mean, there was a stress over that. So yes and no, I think.
Yeah. Well, he was made to be sin.
Mm-hmm.
He who knew no sin was made to be. He became everything that he avoided in life.
That's right.
He always said no to himself. That's what temptation is. Each man is drawn away by his own desires and enticed, James 1 tells us. And so every temptation that Jesus faced, just like every temptation that you and I face, was the devil using his own wishes, our Lord's own wishes, against him. So here's what Jesus wants, and the devil takes what Jesus wants and says, okay, go for it. But Jesus always said no to himself when it conflicted with, as you so beautifully said earlier, when it conflicted with the will of his Father. He always avoided sin by saying no to himself. And so he did no sin. Peter says in 1 Peter chapter 3, he knew no sin. He never sinned, but he was made to be sin. He bore all of the guilt of everybody else's sin by dying on the cross. And he became what he tried to avoid. No wonder he didn't want to do that, and yet still knew he needed to and therefore wanted to do that. So did he want to die? No. Yes. And then think of all of the friendships and relationships that were so dear to him, and his having to say goodbye to all of those. So Jesus was a human being as you and I are, and experienced all of the wishes and desires that we do, but he constantly said no to himself, and therefore yes to God, and was submissive to him even when it was difficult. Therefore, Hebrews 2 says, though he was a son, yet he learned obedience by the things which he suffered. Robert, I thought he was always obedient. What does it mean when he says he learned obedience? As old boy says, explain that one to me.
Well, he had to endure what he endured. He demonstrated. That context goes on to say that he qualified himself as, that sacrificial, but also the high priest who could serve over us. So, he went through it. He did it. It wasn't just that he was willing to, it was that he did.
His obedience didn't come just because he was who he was. Every time he was faced with a temptation, he was faced with a decision, as are you and me. And every time he was faced with a temptation, his decision was, I will make the decision to do what my God wants me to do, not what I want to do. And so he was constantly submissive to his father. And when the conflict arose between something he really wanted to do and this is what God would have him to do, my screen just went dead a minute. Hang on. There it is again. Then, not that I want to see myself or you, but it is what it is. Yeah, every time he was faced with a decision to do what he needed to do, and it was in conflict with the Father, he learned, I will have to say no to me and yes to him. And so he learned obedience. So you come back to Philippians chapter 2. And in Philippians 2, it tells us what Jesus looked like on the inside. He didn't live for himself. He was selfless. Hey, I have rights. You wouldn't hear Jesus talking like that. I stand for civil rights. You wouldn't hear Jesus talking like that. Jesus lived for everyone else. He was selfless. He, therefore, was willing to sacrifice his wishes, sacrifice matters in his life, even sacrifice his life for others. He was selfless and sacrificial. He was a servant of others. He took up the form of a slave to others. All of this talk about slavery. Well, slavery is a bad thing when you place it into the context of America's history. Nobody should own anyone else. But slavery is a good thing when you place it into the context of Christianity, in that we should all volunteer to be a slave to everyone else, in that we live to serve the needs of others. That was the heart of Jesus. And then, of course, he was selfless and sacrificial and serving, and one who was submissive to his heavenly Father. This is the heart of Jesus. This is what Jesus looked like on the inside. And so we come back to that Matthew 10, verse 25. It's enough. I mean, it's just enough for a disciple to be like his master. All a disciple wants to do is just be like his teacher. And Jesus is our teacher, so he's actually telling us, in his mind, a disciple is somebody, all that we want to do is just be like him. And so I want others to study my life and putting your thoughts, my thoughts together. I want others to study my life and to see in me eyes that hurt and extend compassion to the needs of others. I want people to study my life and hear words that flow from lips that share the sweet story of Jesus with others. I want others to study my life and see hands that minister to the needs of others. I want people to study my life and see feet that are eager to go and share the good news of Jesus with others. I want people to study my life and see in me the heart of Jesus, a heart that is selfless, a heart that is sacrificial, a heart that is serving, and a heart that is submissive to God. That's all that I want if I'm a disciple, per the Lord's use of that word. All we want to do is just be like Jesus. A disciple, according to Jesus, is someone who listens to Jesus, and therefore someone who tries his or her hardest to look like Jesus. That's how Jesus used the title disciple. What wonderful thoughts you shared with us today, Robert. Thank you for talking about his eyes and his lips and his hands and his feet, and allowing me to segue into thinking about his heart.
Challenging stuff, but it's so refreshing to, I think this term disciple, we've always heard student, learner, Jesus is my teacher. Okay, I kind of do what he says.
Yeah.
But to flesh it out using Jesus' own concepts and words is awfully helpful.
Yeah.
It really is.
Challenging.
We're going to continue digging into Jesus' use of the title disciple, the Lord willing, in future episodes. Just a quick reminder, you can find more about us at thelightnetwork.tv. Just click on Today with Jesus, and you can see all of our episode archives. If you need to catch up on our previous studies, you can do that as well. Our last episode was a brief diversion because we recorded it from the Light Network conference, and we talked about 2 passages that have helped us to grow in our love for Jesus. Certainly, I think it was applicable to the podcast itself, but a little different than what we've been doing lately this season. So go and check that one out as well if you missed it. Remember, you can subscribe so you never miss an episode. And Today with Jesus releases every Tuesday from wherever you get your podcasts, also on YouTube, and, of course, from our website, thelightnetwork.tv. Thanks for being with us today. Hope you'll join us next time. Until then, let's live with Jesus in our heart and in our ways.
God bless everybody. Thank you, Robert.
Thank you.